Perfect. Well, yeah, definitely appreciate everyone who took time to come to today's webinar. Obviously, it's going to be focused on dev first prevention strategies using PR checks. So my name's Mark Bowen. I'm an implementation consultant here at Snyk. And I started working at Snyk about a year and a half ago, and originally was a customer success manager. And so over the last year and a half, I've talked to a lot of customers who are new to Snyk, who are just adopting the system. But before that, when I was a CSM, I was also working with a lot of customers who had been with Snyk for a year, 2 years, or 3 years. And some of them still hadn't taken the leap to put in any sort of a prevention strategy in place. And I felt like there just really wasn't enough context and information out there to really pull together all of the features and functionality that Snyk has that allows companies to sort of ease into this transition and manage that change. So that's why I wanted to do today's session, is to just have something that's not just focused on a single client that's in my own book of business, but at a broader audience, and then also be able to make that available in the Snyk Hub dashboard. So yeah, I'll go ahead and just start things with general housekeeping. So I wanted to just let everyone know that we're recording today's session, and we're going to email it out to everyone after today's call. Also, in addition to the email, we'll be posting this session on the office hours website, and that can be accessed through our hub, which we can we'll talk about at the end of the session here. And just another reminder, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And we also want people to ask questions. I think it's important to really get through the content because I'm trying to just keep today's conversation fairly high level, to just understand sort of the strategy behind a dev first prevention, and not getting too much into the weeds. I think that there's a lot of great information available in the Snyk documentation to really answer detailed questions. And this is just pulling some of the best practices together so that you know how to get started, basically. But with that said, while we're going through the presentation, if you have questions, just feel free to put those in the chat. If it makes sense to just address that question as it comes in, we'll go ahead and do that. If not, we'll answer it at the end of the presentation, and we'll also open it up for questions, given that we have enough time left. So yeah, I'll go ahead and dive into it. So before I even get started into the agenda, I just wanted to just quickly cover, so what is a dev first prevention strategy in the first place? So it's a strategy for preventing new vulnerabilities from entering production that finds a balance between maintaining your developer velocity and meeting the security requirements of an organization. And this is really at the core of what Snyk does. Since the vision that we've had basically since we founded was building a product that allowed developers to develop fast and stay secure. So we understand that it's not enough to just put in all the security guardrails and go into Snyk and flip all the switches and look good on audits. We also need to maintain velocity, and that's usually where the friction comes into place, or where I've seen it happen, where maybe I'm working with a security team for the implementation of Snyk, and they have their own sort of idea of how they want to be preventing new vulnerabilities. And that's not oftentimes it's not really aligned with what the engineering team is expecting or what they feel is possible. So we're going to just be talking about just, moving towards the direction of meeting the security needs, but also maintaining the velocity.
And Mark, just to set the stage, someone asked, are we discussing Snyk code, SaaS, or open source code, or all of it?
Yeah, so the main focus is going to be Snyk open source and the SaaS scanning, so Snyk code functionality. And yeah, we'll cover that on the next slide as well, or one of the next slides. But great question. Okay, so we'll start out with what are PR checks. Maybe not everyone on the call knows what it is. We'll just quickly cover it. We'll talk about the prerequisites, because we don't want people to get their hopes up if maybe there's not coverage for their tech stack. We also will cover how to enable the PR checks, defining dev-friendly workflows, an example rollout strategy, and then best practices for communication and phasing the rollout. So what is a merge request or a pull request check? Depending on which SDM you're using, it could have different terminology. So it's an automatic test on pull requests on the repositories where they're enabled, basically. So you open up a pull request, and any repository that has the check enabled, it'll run a check automatically. So it just happens before, and it basically happens before you go ahead and press the merge button or merge pull request. It's integrated directly into your workflow. So that same workflow that the developers are following today, where they open up a pull request, it's right there. Nothing changes. It's automatically populates as a check in the SCM. And really what this is doing is it's providing visibility and awareness to the developers where they're working today. So directly in the exact same workflow and process that they're following, they have some security feedback coming in from Snyk. All right, so the prerequisites here are an integration with a compatible SCM, so source code manager, to a package manager compatibility. So not all manifest files are created equally. And so, yeah, I just want people to just go into the Snyk docs if you're not sure, and just double check that the SCM that you're using has the ability for PR checks. Most of them do. And then the same thing with package managers. We have, like, and the other thing I'll just call out here is that we do have very wide coverage with PR checks, but it's just good to understand where the coverage exists. So how do we enable PR checks? And this is going to answer the question that came in earlier. So the first way that we can do it is very simple and great. We just go into the Snyk UI, we adjust some settings, and it automatically creates a webhook in our SCM. So I've worked with a lot of customers who they didn't think it was going to be that easy. Yeah, that is definitely one of the nice things about using the UI. We can also create a GitHub action within your SCM. So this is, back to the first point. So directly through the UI, you can create it for open sourcing code. So those are the two products where we can enable it. For the code analysis, that's still in beta. So if you go into the settings and you don't see it there, reach out to your account team. We can also create a GitHub action. So if you're using a package manager where we don't have native PR check integration available, well, a GitHub action could be like a workaround here. And the other thing is that we can also look for other vulnerabilities outside of open sourcing code because we're leveraging the CLI. All right, so let me just take a moment here to go into the Snyk UI. And I'm just going to quickly show how to enable the checks. So PR checks are like the sort of the first layer or the most broad place that we can enable it is at the organization level, because typically organizations are broken by team or portions of the application. And some teams have higher security needs or just further, like just more mature with their security processes than others. So we give that ability to just set it up at the organization level. And if you go into the settings, you see the integrations that you have enabled already. Or you could just go into integrations and find it from there. But if I go into GitHub, this is my integration settings for GitHub. And if I scroll down, I see that we have open source security and licenses, and we have code analysis. So these are the PR checks that would be running. And we can basically just go in here, we can hit enable. What that does is that it enables it on all of the repositories that are using package managers where we have compatibility. And you would see that PR check populate anytime you open up a PR. And Snyk is providing a message within the PR to either a green check mark or a red X to indicate to the developers like whether or not there's something here they need to be concerned about. The most important thing to keep in mind with PR checks, or in my opinion, one of the most important things, is that when you enable this and the check becomes visible in your SCM, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a required check in your SCM. So if you're using GitHub and you're enabling PR checks for the first time, you have to go in and enable a branch protection rule for each of the repositories. And that needs to be done on the GitHub side that's independent from Snyk. So Snyk is providing the feedback to within your SCM, and then you need to decide and go in if whether or not that's a required check. If it's not a required check, that means that the check does not need to complete and it does not need to pass for the developer to go forward with the merge. And that can sometimes be a good thing, because if you're thinking about how you can sort of ease developers into this process and this transition and change, you can just provide the visibility. They now have security feedback directly where they're working and where they're building the product, and there's no friction and there's no blocking. So you're sort of taking that first step. The next thing to point out is the fail conditions that are available for open source and security licenses. So we can also set whether or not we want Snyk to look at only newly added dependencies, so just the dependencies that the developer is adding in that PR, or if we want to fail on any vulnerabilities that new or existing. And then we can set the threshold. So we could say critical and high severity issues. And then we could say only when there's a fix available. So if you start to play around with some of these settings, you can think about ways that you could phase out or sort of reach different objectives using these. So this would say a good way to introduce it to the developers is to say, well, now it's a required check, but we're only going to fail when you yourself are adding a dependency that has a vulnerability that's at least a critical or a high, and when there's an alternative version or a fix available. So I think it's really finding that balance to understand with the development team, like what's acceptable, and sort of understand what their own threshold is that they're comfortable with. And that can be a sort of a good phase two. And then if we look at the code analysis section, so again, we either enable it, we disable it. It has to be a required check in the SCM. And it's only looking at newly introduced SAST issues. So we don't have the ability to say, also include the backlog. And then we would actually set the severity level in terms of what we want to catch. So this is applying it at the org level. And we can also go to the projects tab, and my UI might be a little bit different because there's a UI change that's coming here, but I can go into any of the files. Actually, maybe I'll show it with a open source file. I can go into any one of these files and you'll actually see a settings tab, and there's a GitHub integrations section underneath here. And for Snyk tests for pull requests, we can either inherit the integration settings at the org level, or we can set this custom and then enable it this way. So this is a way of saying, well, if we're going to roll this out, we maybe not want to roll it out across all of the repositories in any of the orgs that we have, but there's like a specific file or repository where we can enable this at a smaller scale to get some feedback from like a single development team if we wanted to. Or if there's just certain files or that you want to have different security gates on, you can set them up this way as well. All right, so I'll go back into the presentation here. So that's how we enable PR checks. Whenever we're making a change that's going to sort of impact other people within the organization, we need to think through that process. We need to put ourselves into the developer's shoes, and we need to think, how is this change going to affect their day-to-day? And so what I have here is just a very basic workflow for what it looks like when we enable PR checks. So now what happens is that a change gets made locally, PR basically gets opened for it. When that PR is opened, Snyk runs a check and it either passes or it fails. If no vulnerabilities are picked up, then the PR gets merged. If a vulnerability gets picked up, the thing that we want is the developers to fix it. But we need to also recognize that maybe we're not in a situation where we can block for everything. maybe there's some upgrades, maybe that there's just like no upgrades that are available for a certain dependency, or maybe there's an upgrade that's available that's a breaking change and you just can't go forward with it, or at least not now. And this is really the part of the process that is like, don't take this part lightly and just really think this through. And this is where, enabling PR checks for a single file or repository and working with one team and would allow you to really refine that process and understand what it looks like from the developer's perspective. And some of the things within Snyk that we can use to sort of mitigate any added friction that we're introducing into the SDLC is by determining who has the ability to override the PR check and who can ignore issues. So these are two different things. Overriding the check, just basically what that looks like. If you have a required check set up in GitHub, for an example, or a branch protection rule set up for the Snyk check, you now have to wait for the check to complete. It has to pass, but you can go in and see the result in Snyk. And if whoever has the ability to override the check, there's a button that's available when they're looking at the results that says mark check as successful in the SCM. That means that if you go back to that PR or merge request in your SCM, you can go forward with the merge. None of the new vulnerabilities or the vulnerabilities are ignored. They're picked up still in the reporting and in the Snyk dashboard and by the security team. So that's one way of dealing with it. The other way is determining we need to ignore this vulnerability for a set amount of time because there's nothing we can do about it right now. Or we know that this just is not vulnerable, so we're going to ignore it. So I'll just quickly go back into the Snyk UI here again. And so at the organization settings is where we have the ability to set who can ignore vulnerabilities. And then if we go to the group level, and if you're an enterprise customer, you can go into members. Unfortunately, I'm not an enterprise customer. I'm just a Snyk employee. So I don't have it, but it would say member roles. And what this allows you to do is create a custom role that you could have a custom role for like each one of the phases if you're rolling this out, where maybe for one of the phases, the developers have the ability to mark the check as successful, and in a later phase, they don't. So you can adjust the roles. You can have different phases, or you can just change the roles as you go. If you're creating a custom role, I'd recommend create the role, assign it to somebody, and just make sure that that the user can still do all the tasks and the things they need to do in the system. And that you didn't strip down too much unintentionally. Okay, so this brings us to an example rollout strategy. So this is based off of something that I've seen customers use in the past, and it's just an example of here's the phase, here's when we're going to launch this phase, and then here's the different characteristics or the settings that we're going to enable. So the first phase, it will not be a required check. It will just be visibility for the developers. Nothing else matters because it's not a required check. It's just sort of easing into the process, giving the developers time to get comfortable using Snyk, scanning in their IDEs, their CLIs, and just how to find and fix vulnerabilities in the UI as well. It's definitely helpful at that portion. The phase 2, you can make it a required check. The gating severity would be critical. You'd only be gating for new issues. Anybody would be able to override it, so the developers can mark the check as successful, but maybe only the security team can ignore the vulnerabilities. But it's really taking a look at all of the settings that you have in your disposal and understanding that Snyk is a developer-first security tool, and we've thought things through from the developer's perspective. And a lot of the settings that we have here are to really find a middle ground so that the security team and the developers can work together. So this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of rollout strategy. This is going to be thinking about your own processes. Your first phase is just going to be based off of where your team is today. If you've displaced another tool and your developers are already used to being blocked for net new issues, then maybe that's where you start. So you're starting a little bit ahead than most people. And then your last phase just should be in line with what your security objectives are. So you have a starting point and you have where you want to be, and you have all of the steps you need to take to get there. So it's not just one day you roll out a security strategy and guardrails that shut down the SDLC and it's just sort of too far in one direction. You're like giving the developers time to get used to Snyk. And the reality is that when you think about security tools, there really wasn't much for the developers before Snyk. It was like vulnerability reporting that picked up vulnerabilities. So using a tool like Snyk is new to a lot of developers, and it's just taking that into consideration and understanding that, like, to be successful, it usually requires just easing into some of the changes that you'd like to see in your organization. All right, so communication and phasing the rollout. So the very first thing to start with before turning anything on, well, you could turn on the visibility for the PR checks. That really doesn't do anything, but besides just give visibility, but the developer training, start with this. You can do a training session with your team. We also offer paid developer training sessions as well if you don't have a CSM or you're outside of your implementation. Yeah, so you would have a training. We also have training.snyk.io that goes through most of what we cover in a developer training session, and it's self-serve learning for the developers. We also have learn.snyk.io, which is security training for developers. So this isn't how do you use Snyk to scan and fix vulnerabilities. This is just general security stuff. So what is a cross-site scripting issue? Why should you avoid having those? And how do you like make sure that you're not adding those to your code base going forward? Another thing that can be helpful is sharing the workflows with the stakeholders. So share it with the developers so that they understand this is what's going to happen when we move into the next phase. When I open up a PR, this is what it's going to look like. If I'm blocked, this is how I can quickly unblock myself. And then always communicating ahead of time when a new phase is being rolled out. So the first phase is usually developer training. Introduce Snyk to the developers. And then if you're like moving towards a prevention strategy or another phase of the prevention strategy, making sure you're communicating that 30 days, 60 days in advance to say, hey, team, we're doing a great job in the phase where we're in today. Based off of our rollout strategy, the next phase kicks in 30 days. If anybody has any questions about it, here's the new workflow. Here's what it's going to look like. And having a call with the developers as well to just have a session where they can ask questions and learn more about what specifically is going to change in the upcoming phase. All right, so yeah, we'll do Q&A, but also just in case we don't have time, we have a lot of great resources here. So there's the developer launch package. So lots of like a central place where we have lots of communication and just resources on how to introduce developers to Snyk. Snyk pull request documentation. We have GitHub actions for PR checks. These are some pre-created actions that you can add to your pipeline. And then we also have some basic workflows. So I think it was 2 days ago or yesterday, one of my colleagues actually did a workflow session. So this is session 1 of, I think, 3 that they'll be doing. So yeah, if you want to just learn more about setting up those workflows, there'll be a lot of relevant information around phasing and how to set up settings and ignores as you're like that could be applied to the different phases that you're going to be rolling out. So definitely worth participating in that. All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. People are able to come off mute, right, Maddie?
Yeah, I will
Okay.
click approve that. And then you can also drop it in the chat, or you'll see a QA button and you can populate your question there. It's going to take me a second to give everyone permission to talk. But yeah, feel free to come off mute. Charles says, I have no questions. Great presentation. So kudos to Mark. Thank you, Charles.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. All right. I have a feeling that maybe it was pretty straightforward, like not really much to add on to this. I think it's a pretty like basic strategy, but I also have, like, talking with other Snyk customers about this. It seemed like something that when I brought it up, there wasn't like a lot of questions around it, but they found it to be pretty helpful and a good way of thinking about introducing some new security guardrails to the developers.
And Oliver just asks, he says he's new to Snyk and what languages are used for static code analysis. And I believe that's in our user docs. Mark, if you have them memorized, let me know.
I wish I was at that level, but yeah, the good news here is that it's broad enough that I don't know them all off the top of my head. But what I would recommend for like any compatibility or with Snyk is just to Google Snyk, whatever the language is or the technology, and then docs. And yeah, and also like Snyk, if it was like Snyk code, Python, Snyk docs, it would basically bring you to the page that talks exactly about like how Snyk code is scanning for Python and if there's compatibility there as well. I'm not able to see the questions for some reason. Maybe because I have to close my screen. There we go. Oh, perfect.
No, just some chat with links. Thanks.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, if there's no other questions, I guess we'll go ahead and close it off here.
Oh, one last question from Oliver. Is there any integration for Azure DevOps pipelines? Yeah, so for this, yeah, again, I would just search the Snyk docs to see what's available there, but it sounds like this is something where you'd be leveraging the Snyk CLI for. So yeah, I would, yeah, do some work in terms of the Snyk docs. Like the helpful places here are going to be the CI/CD integration, the CLI commands, and also just searching DevOps pipelines, Snyk docs. Okay, well, everyone, we will follow up with the recording, the PDF of the deck, and URLs to everything we talked about here. So make sure to join us for future office hours, and thank you for coming. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.